Every day we wake up and repeat small patterns. Brushing our teeth, checking our phones, drinking coffee, scrolling through messages, commuting, working, resting, sleeping. These tiny actions, so ordinary that they almost disappear into the background, are not random. They form a network of routines that quietly shape who we are, what we achieve, and the kind of life we live. Charles Duhigg, in The Power of Habit, explores this invisible architecture of behavior, the science that explains why habits exist and how they can be changed. It's a story that blends psychology, neuroscience, business strategy, and human emotion into one simple truth. If you can understand your habits, you can redesign your life. It starts with something deceptively simple, a loop, the habit loop. Every habit, good or bad, follows the same three-step process. Cue, routine, reward. The cue is the trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode. The routine is the behavior itself. And the reward is what reinforces the habit, making your brain crave it again. Imagine you wake up in the morning. The cue is the sound of your alarm. The routine is reaching for your phone. The reward is that tiny hit of satisfaction, a sense of connection, stimulation, maybe even a little dopamine rush. Your brain learns this pattern and soon it becomes automatic. We think we make decisions consciously every day, but in truth, much of what we do runs on autopilot. Habits are mental shortcuts that save energy. They're our brain's way of being efficient, of doing more with less effort. But that efficiency can work both ways, can help us achieve greatness, or trap us in cycles we don't even notice. Charles Duhigg tells us about a man named Eugene Pauly, a story that reveals just how deep habits go. Eugene suffered a brain infection that destroyed parts of his memory. He couldn't remember where he lived or what he'd just eaten. Yet, he could still find his way home from a walk around the block. He didn't know the route consciously. His brain simply remembered the pattern. This discovery showed scientists that habits don't live in the parts of the brain responsible for conscious memory. They exist in the basal ganglia, a primitive part of the brain that stores repeated behaviors as automatic routines. This means that even when we forget almost everything, our habits can still drive us. That's the power and danger of habits. They're hardwired into our brains. You can't erase them. You can only replace them. And that's where change begins. To change a habit, you can't simply remove it. You have to keep the same cue and reward but change the routine in between. For example, if your cue is stress and your routine is smoking with the reward being relaxation, you can't eliminate stress or the desire to relax. But you can teach your brain a new routine that delivers the same reward. Maybe deep breathing, a quick walk, or a glass of water. It's not easy, but it's possible. Duhigg calls this the golden rule of habit change. Keep the cue and reward the same but shift the behavior. That's how transformation begins, not by breaking habits, but by reshaping them. Every great transformation story follows this invisible structure. Take the story of Tony Dungy, the American football coach who turned one of the worst teams in the NFL into champions. He didn't overwhelm his players with complicated strategies. Instead, he trained them to rely on simple automatic reactions, habits, so they could perform flawlessly even under pressure. He made them practice the same moves repeatedly until they became second nature. He believed that in high-stress moments, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your training. And your training is nothing more than your habits in action. This approach turned the Tampa Bay Buccaneers into one of the most consistent teams in the league. Dungy didn't just change their plays, he changed their behavior patterns. And when their habits changed, their destiny changed too. But habits aren't just personal. They exist in organizations, companies, and entire societies. Duhigg explains how corporate habits shape the success or failure of businesses. He gives us the example of Paul O'Neill, the CEO who transformed Alcoa, a struggling aluminum company, into one of the most profitable firms in America. O'Neill didn't talk about profit margins or growth. He focused on one thing: safety. Sounded strange, but O'Neill understood that safety wasn't just a goal. It was a keystone habit. A single behavior that, when changed, triggers a ripple effect across the entire organization. By improving safety, Alcoa had to improve communication, training, management systems, and worker engagement. Within a few years, accidents dropped, productivity soared, and profits multiplied. This is the magic of keystone habits. They're like the first domino that sets off a chain reaction of positive change. And the same is true in our personal lives. For some people, it's exercising. For others, it's waking up early, journaling, or making the bed. These small keystone habits might seem trivial, but they create momentum. They build discipline and a sense of control that spills into every part of life. When you start running every morning, you might also start eating healthier, sleeping better, and thinking clearer. One good habit gives birth to another. That's the quiet compounding power of routine, the same force that builds fortunes and shapes destinies. Yet not all habits are visible. Some lie deep within us, in our cravings, emotions, and environments. Duhigg writes about how marketers use this science to influence our choices. Companies like Procter & Gamble discovered that to sell products like Febreze, they needed to tap into habit loops. They learned that people rarely buy cleaning products to remove bad smells. They buy them to complete a satisfying routine. When Febreze added a fresh scent that users associated with cleanliness, sales exploded. In other words, the secret to habit formation lies not in logic but in emotion, in craving. When you crave the reward, your brain begins the loop automatically. Craving is the engine of habit. Without craving, there's no repetition. That's why addiction and success share the same neural pathway. The difference lies in what we choose to crave. If you can create a craving for growth, learning, and improvement, your habits can become your allies. Invisible forces pulling you toward the life you want. But sometimes, habits control us in darker ways. Consider the story of a woman who gambled away her savings. Her brain scans revealed that the excitement of risk, the craving for the reward of winning, triggered her habit loop so powerfully that it overrode rational thought. She wasn't addicted to money. She was addicted to the feeling of anticipation. This is the hidden truth about human behavior. We don't act because of reason, we act because of desire. And to master our habits, we must learn to reshape what we desire. When you start to see habits not as cages but as tools, something you can understand, edit, and rebuild, you begin to gain control over your mind. You start to realize that your life today is simply a collection of what you repeatedly do. Success is not a single act, but a system of behaviors that align with your goals. So, if you can change your habits, you can change your life. When we think about changing our lives, we often imagine dramatic transformations. Overnight success, big resolutions, or sudden breakthroughs. But Duhigg reminds us that real change rarely happens in big moments. It happens in small, almost invisible shifts, the tiny decisions that compound over time. Think of a person trying to lose weight. It doesn't start with a crash diet or an intense workout plan. It starts with something small, maybe tracking meals or walking 10 minutes after dinner. Over days and weeks, that small act becomes a pattern, a habit loop reinforced by a simple reward. Feeling better, lighter, more in control. And eventually, that small decision grows into a new identity. Because habits are not just about what we do. They're about who we become. When you consistently act a certain way, your brain rewires itself to support that behavior. You begin to think of yourself differently. As a runner, a reader, a disciplined person, a learner. And once identity shifts, habits stick naturally. This is why willpower alone isn't enough. Willpower is like a muscle, it can be strong, but it also gets tired. If you rely on raw willpower to change, you'll eventually hit a wall. That's why so many resolutions fade. But if you build habits around your environment and identity, you don't need to fight yourself every day. Duhigg shares fascinating research about willpower as a habit itself. In one experiment, people who practiced small acts of self-control, like keeping a food diary or managing their posture, began to improve in other areas of life too. They became more disciplined at work, better with money, more patient in relationships. It wasn't magic. It was the brain learning the habit of control, the pattern of resisting impulses and acting intentionally. So willpower isn't something you're born with. It's something you build. And that's a powerful realization. In workplaces, this principle can be transformative. Some companies use what Duhigg calls habit-based cultures, environments where good behaviors become automatic. Take Starbucks, for example. The company doesn't just train baristas to make coffee. They train them to handle stressful situations using pre-planned routines. When a customer yells or complains, baristas follow a system called the latte method. Listen, acknowledge, take action, thank the customer, and explain. This routine becomes a habit, so even under stress, employees respond calmly and consistently. The result? Less stress, happier customers, and a smoother business. Habits like these remove emotional friction. They turn chaos into calm and reaction into control. And that's the secret to mastering your habits. Design systems that work when you don't feel like it. Because we all have moments when motivation fades. When the day feels heavy or life gets messy. But habits, once built, don't depend on motivation. They just run. You don't think about brushing your teeth. You just do it. Imagine if reading, learning, exercising, or creating became that effortless. That's the real goal of habit formation, to automate the actions that build the life you want. One of the most inspiring examples in Duhigg's book comes from the civil rights movement. In 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. That single act wasn't random. It was part of a larger social habit, a network of small relationships and community behaviors that had been building for years. When Parks was arrested, the people around her didn't just feel sympathy. They acted. They joined, they organized, they marched. That response was automatic, the result of social habits of trust and cooperation. Within days, the Montgomery bus boycott began. A movement that lasted more than a year and became a turning point in American history. This shows that habits aren't just personal or organizational. They can be collective. Social habits can shape nations. They can start revolutions. And every great movement, from civil rights to environmental change, begins the same way, with a cue, a routine, and a reward. The cue might be injustice. The routine is action. The reward is dignity, freedom, or progress. Understanding this helps us see that habits don't just define our mornings. They define our world. But how can we apply this to our own lives, every single day? It starts with awareness. Most people live on autopilot, unaware of what drives their behaviors. But if you start observing your patterns, the cues that trigger you, the routines you follow, the rewards you seek, you begin to see the loops that control you. You might notice that when you feel stressed, you open social media. When you feel bored, you reach for snacks. When you feel lonely, you scroll endlessly. These aren't weaknesses. They're loops. And loops can be reprogrammed. Write them down. Identify the cue, the routine, and the reward. Then experiment with replacing just the routine. Instead of scrolling, maybe you text a friend. Instead of snacking, maybe you take a short walk. The goal isn't perfection. It's progress. Because every time you choose differently, your brain rewires a little. Neural pathways start to shift. And slowly, the new behavior becomes automatic. That's how habits evolve, not in a day, but through repetition and intention. Duhigg also emphasizes the importance of belief. In every story of lasting transformation, there's a moment when people start to believe change is possible. You can have the best system, the perfect plan, the smartest strategy, but without belief, habits collapse under pressure. Belief is the invisible glue that holds transformation together. In Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, belief plays a central role. Members follow routines, meetings, sharing stories, repeating mantras, but the deeper power lies in faith. Not necessarily religious faith, but belief in support, in community, in the idea that change is possible because others have done it too. That shared belief strengthens willpower, especially when life gets hard. It turns personal struggle into collective resilience. And that's something we can all learn from. You don't have to believe in a perfect future. Just believe that you can change. Because every great change begins with one small act of belief. The belief that today's choice matters, that your effort counts, that you are not stuck where you are. Habits can feel like chains, but they can also be wings. The same loops that trap you in procrastination, distraction, or self-doubt can be rewired to pull you toward focus, growth, and peace. The structure never changes, only the direction does. And that's the power of understanding this science. When you start to see yourself as the designer of your own behavior, when you realize you can edit your loops, life becomes a canvas again. It's not about perfection. It's about progress. If you fail, that's okay. Failure is part of the loop too. Every mistake gives you feedback. Every setback shows you what cue or reward needs adjustment. And eventually, through patience and awareness, your old habits fade quietly into the background, replaced by new patterns that align with who you want to be. That's how people build new lives. Not by fighting the past, but by creating new loops that make the old ones irrelevant. You can begin today. Start small. Choose one habit. Make it easy, repeatable, and rewarding. Anchor it to a cue that already exists. Maybe it's reading one page after breakfast, writing one line before bed, doing one push-up after brushing your teeth. These tiny actions might seem meaningless, but they hold the seed of transformation. Because habits grow, they compound, they multiply, and one day, without realizing it, you'll look back and see that you've built a life that feels peaceful, purposeful, and powerful, all through the quiet rhythm of your habits. This is the essence of the power of habit. Our lives are the sum of our habits. What we repeat becomes who we are. And when we learn to choose our patterns intentionally, we take back control of everything. Our time, our focus, our future. So start today. Notice the cues. Redesign the routines. Keep the rewards that matter. And build a life where your habits work for you, not against you. Because in the end, you don't decide your future. You decide your habits. And your habits decide your future. Every powerful transformation, whether in an individual or an organization, starts with awareness. The moment you see your patterns clearly for the first time, you realize that what feels like destiny is often just a routine. What feels like chaos is just a system you haven't yet understood. And what feels impossible to change is simply a habit waiting to be rewritten. Charles Duhigg didn't write The Power of Habit to give us rules. He wrote it to give us understanding. Because once you understand the architecture of behavior, cue, routine, reward, you hold the blueprint for change. Let's go deeper into how habits silently govern success in every part of life. Health, work, relationships, and even creativity. Think about health first. So many of us struggle to exercise, eat right, or sleep on time. We see these as issues of discipline. But Duhigg shows they're really issues of design. If you come home tired and your gym clothes are buried in a drawer, your brain faces friction. If junk food is visible on the counter, that's your cue, and your habit loop starts running before you even think. But if you prepare your environment, if your shoes are ready, your water bottle is filled, your space is clean, your brain receives a different cue. And when you link that cue to a simple, repeatable routine, transformation begins effortlessly. Small cues matter. They whisper directions to your subconscious. That's why great performers design their environment, not just their mindset. In workplaces, the same principle applies. Successful teams and companies don't just have great strategies, they have great habits. They build rhythms of communication, trust, and reflection. Duhigg describes organizational habits as the routines that guide how decisions are made when no one is watching. These habits determine whether a company reacts with chaos or confidence during a crisis. For example, when a tragic fire broke out in a London underground station in 1987, investigators discovered that the disaster wasn't caused by a single mistake. It was the product of bad organizational habits. Poor communication, weak routines, and the absence of accountability had built up silently over time. That tragedy forced a complete overhaul of how safety routines were designed. New cues, new responses, new habits. And as those new patterns spread, the entire organization transformed. The lesson? Habits determine not just personal outcomes, but collective resilience. Now, let's move to creativity. It's easy to believe creativity is spontaneous, a spark from nowhere. But even creativity follows patterns. Great artists, writers, and innovators often rely on structured habits to make space for inspiration. Duhigg gives examples of how routine fosters innovation. Take the story of a Broadway musical that was failing before opening night. The problem wasn't talent or story, it was the team's habits. Once they adjusted how they collaborated, how they gave feedback, how they practiced, everything changed. When routines support freedom, creativity thrives. That's the paradox of habits. They create structure, but within that structure we find space to fly. Think about your own life. How much energy do you spend fighting yourself? Trying to remember what to do, pushing through resistance, forcing motivation. Imagine if instead, the right actions just happened, not because you were trying harder, but because your environment and cues made them natural. That's what great habits do. They free your mind to focus on what truly matters. When Duhigg explores the science of habit change, he also points to the craving brain, the way our minds chase rewards. Understanding this craving is key to mastering habits. You can't eliminate craving. You can only direct it. If you crave comfort, build comfort into your healthy routines, like listening to music during workouts or enjoying a peaceful tea after journaling. If you crave excitement, find it in learning, exploring, creating. The goal isn't to fight your desires. It's to align them with your vision. Let's talk about keystone habits again. Those small changes that ignite transformation everywhere. For some people, it's exercise. For others, it's tracking spending, meditating, or even making the bed. These habits build a sense of mastery that bleeds into other areas of life. When you start exercising, you might unconsciously begin eating better. When you start journaling, you might communicate more clearly. When you meditate, you handle stress differently. That's because one positive habit changes how you see yourself. And once your identity shifts, other habits naturally align. This is why focusing on one key behavior can change everything. Not because that behavior is magical, but because it gives you momentum, the belief that you can change. Belief, that invisible force, returns repeatedly in Duhigg's work. He found that every person or group that sustained change shared one thing: belief. Belief that transformation is possible. Belief that failure isn't final. Belief that small steps matter. Without belief, willpower fades when life gets tough. But when belief is strong, habits endure even through storms. That's why communities are powerful. Surround yourself with people who remind you that progress is possible. Their faith becomes your fuel. When you join a group where change is normal, where everyone reads, learns, or practices something, it's easier to follow. Your brain mirrors the habits of those around you. Habits are contagious, for better or worse. So choose your circle carefully. There's a beautiful symmetry in all of this. Habits begin with cues and rewards, but they end with identity and purpose. At first, you build a habit consciously. Later, the habit builds you. You start by acting, and soon those actions sculpt your beliefs, your confidence, and your life. And that's why this book, The Power of Habit, isn't just about psychology. It's about destiny. Every day you stand at a crossroad. One path is automatic, led by your old loops. The other path requires awareness, choosing what serves you. Each time you choose differently, your brain rewires. Slowly, your future shifts direction. Duhigg ends his book with a profound truth. Change might not be fast, and it isn't always easy, but with time and consistency, it becomes automatic. Transformation is less about force and more about design. If you build the right systems, if you understand your cues, routines, and rewards, your habits will take care of the rest. You won't need constant motivation, because momentum will take over. And that's the greatest freedom, when good behavior becomes your default. So, as this story ends, think about your own loops. What are the cues that guide you? What routines do they trigger? And what rewards keep you returning? You don't have to change everything. Just change one loop. Replace one routine. Build one positive pattern. Because every great journey begins with a single decision. And that decision can happen today. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine your future self. The person who lives with focus, peace, and purpose. That version of you already exists. It's built one habit at a time. Every morning routine, every mindful choice, every repeated action is laying bricks for that life. Keep going. Even on days when it feels pointless, every repetition is rewiring your mind. Every tiny step forward is planting seeds of transformation. And one day, without noticing, you'll realize you've become the person you always hoped to be. Not because of a single decision, but because of 1,000 invisible ones, repeated day after day. That's the true power of habit. It's not just about doing more. It's about becoming more. Your habits are the invisible architecture of your destiny. Design them well and your future will follow. Thank you for spending your time listening to this full audiobook-style summary of The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. If you found value in this, don't forget to share it with someone who's ready to take control of their life, one small habit at a time. Remember, habits build identity, and identity builds destiny. So start small, stay consistent, and keep believing in the quiet power of daily action. Until next time, keep growing, keep learning, and keep building the life you were meant to live.